It is one of the most powerful and stirring marches, the March of the York Corps, or York March. And it wasn't even composed by a soldier, but by someone on the 17th of December, 1770 in Bonn, Ludwig van Beethoven. However, his Dutch van does not indicate noble origin, but rather the place of origin of the bearer's family, in his case probably the small village of Bettenhoven, Bettencourt in the province of Liège. The march composed by Beethoven in 1809 was initially called March for Archduke Anton, Joseph Anton von Österreich, the Imperial Austrian Field Marshal, who lived from 1776 to 1847, mostly in Budapest. But then, in 1813, it was renamed York March, in honor of the Prussian Field Marshal Ludwig Yorck von Wartenburg. From then on, whether in the Old Army, Weimar Republic's Reichswehr, or the Wehrmacht. To this day, this significant march plays an important role in German military music. In the Bundeswehr, the York March is the traditional march of the Guard Battalion and the prescribed entry march at the Grosse Zapfenstreich, and in the German Democratic Republic, it was the honor march of the National People's Army. But who was the namesake of this march? Ludwig von York, who was elevated to the rank of Count in March 1814 at the age of 55, and then bore the additional name von Wartenburg. He was born in Potsdam on the 26th September, 1759, as the illegitimate child of the Prussian officer David Jonathan von Yorsch and the Potsdam craftsman's daughter, Maria Sophie Pflug. They were only able to marry after receiving one of the rarely granted marriage permits from Frederick the Great when Ludwig was 4 years old. This strange practice, that old Fritz preferred to have unmarried officers in his army, only ended under his successor, King Frederick William II. He also legitimized the semi-official marriages and the children born from them. When Ludwig was 13 years old, in 1772, he joined the Prussian infantry regiment von Borke in December as a free corporal, also called a lance corporal or ensign, which later became Regiment Number 21. In July 1773, he then joined the garrison regiment of Field Marshal Caspar Fabian Gottlieb von Luck, which later received the number 53. In the Luck Regiment, York was promoted to ensign in 1775 and 2 years later, in 1777, to second lieutenant. But here, for the first time, he also revealed his true nature, with which he repeatedly pushed through with his incorruptible sense of justice, even if it could have cost him his head. He didn't act loudly, hastily, or thoughtlessly. Instead, true to his nature, he acted after careful thought. This was also the case when his superior, Staff Captain Raurath, once boasted during a parade in the autumn of 1779 that he had stolen an altar cloth during the Bavarian War of Succession, which lasted from July 1778 to May 1779. As a result, the 21-year-old second lieutenant York showed him his contempt so clearly that he was dismissed from the army in January 1780 for insubordination. He had to serve a 1-year prison sentence at the Friedrichsburg fortress in Königsberg. But when he tried to return to the army after his release, it was forbidden by Frederick the Great himself. York then joined the Swiss colonial regiment Murat in July 1781 as a captain, that is, as a Hauptmann. This Marine infantry regiment under Colonel Charles Daniel de Murat from Neuchâtel, French-speaking Neuchâtel, consisted of 1,100 men in 10 companies of 104 men each, and was in the service of the Dutch East India Company. Here is their symbol. In it, on the 20th of March 1802, Dutch merchants joined forces to eliminate competition among themselves. Equipped by the Dutch state with trade monopolies, sovereign rights in land acquisition, warfare, and fortress construction. This made the East India Company one of the largest trading enterprises of the 17th and 18th centuries. As for the Swiss Colonial Regiment, here is its flag. It is more than remarkable that for a period of 261 years, from 1568 to 1829, Little Switzerland alone provided 31 regiments for service in the Dutch East India Company, an estimated 80,000 men. But another number is even more remarkable. So, between 1450 and 1880, that is, over more than 4 centuries, about 2 million Swiss are said to have served in foreign armies, often voluntarily. Half of them for France, and it's said that 1 in 3 of them died doing so. Even in Prussia, there were 2 Swiss units between 1696 and 1848. From 1696 to 1713, the Swiss Palace Guard, with the strength of a company consisting of 24 officers and 80 men, was responsible for the safety of the elector and the interior of his palaces. Here, green dots at the coronation of Friedrich I in Königsberg, and the Guard Rifle Battalion, established in 1804 with a strength of 429 men. This battalion was led from 1814 to 1817 by Major Charles Gustave de Meuron, the nephew of the commander of the Marine Infantry Regiment, Colonel Charles Daniel de Meuron, in which Yorck served from 1781. In March 1882, the regiment was then assembled on the French Atlantic island of Oleron. From there, it sailed on to the Cape of Good Hope, where on the 7th February 1783, they disembarked, and until 1784, they participated on the French side in the East India Campaign against the English. 2 years later, in 1786, the year of Frederick the Great's death, Captain Yorck returned to Germany and immediately requested to be reinstated in service. But then, for the second time, Frederick's rejection was delivered to him, this time in the unmistakable style of the King of Prussia. After his last naval service, I must reasonably have reservations about reinstating him in the infantry, and it would be just like if a cook wanted to become a dance master. And after Friedrich's death, his successor, his nephew, Friedrich Wilhelm II, Yorck's request was initially rejected. But then a year later, it was approved, and in May 1787, he was granted a commission as captain and company commander. On the 6th of July, 1792, in the same year, Yorck was also promoted to major. He had been promoted in Lower Silesian Namslau. On the 26th of September, 1768, he married Johanna Henrietta Seidel, with whom he had 3 children. In 1798, Heinrich Count Yorck von Wartenburg was killed. On the 7th July, 1801, Bertha Countess Yorck von Wartenburg died. And in 1805, Ludwig Count Yorck von Wartenburg died. He was the trustee at Kleinols in Silesia. That's what you call an institution of inheritance and property law, by which a family's assets, mostly land, were to be kept together forever through foundations, and only one family member at a time receives the right of usufruct. After his participation in the Polish campaign of 1794 to 1795, Major Yorck was appointed battalion commander. In 1805, he became a colonel and commander of the Light Infantry Regiment. In this role, he developed principles of combat training that were based on the written experiences from the American War of Independence, which took place from 1775 to 1783. The operational experiences of the tirailleurs in France, as the infantry fighting in loose order was called there, were also known in Germany as skirmishers. Their skirmishing was intended to unsettle the enemy through continuous, even if ineffective, fire to keep them occupied and thereby weaken them. Even as a company commander, Yorck was considered an unapproachable character who pursued his goals with great persistence and was very strict in service. The pay was just as meager as the rations. Once, when one of his officers in the Feldjäger regiment complained about the food, he replied, "If a junior officer is hungry, he should read his commission and take pleasure in the fact that he enjoys all the privileges of his rank." But despite his strictness, Yorck was also very popular with his soldiers because of his strong sense of justice. Then, however, on October 9th, 1806, it got interesting. Until the 9th October, 1806, the Third Napoleonic War began and lasted until July 9th, 1807. It was also called the Campaign against Prussia, in which France and its allied states, such as the German members of the Confederation of the Rhine, and on the other side, mainly Prussia and Russia, fought against each other. It also took place on the 14th October, 1806, when the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt took, in which the Prussian Saxon army was decisively defeated. Napoleon marched into Berlin on the 20th October, and the old Prussia of Frederick the Great had finally perished. Yorck had taken part in the War of 1806, which had gone so badly for Prussia. He took part as a colonel and commander of the 1st Light Brigade, among other things as a rear guard for the corps of Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher during the battles that took place in the Prenzlau-Lübeck area. But in the battle at Lübeck from the 6th to the 7th November, 1806, between 53,000 French under Napoleon's brother-in-law, General Joachim Murat, and 21,000 Prussians under Blücher, Yorck was wounded in the fierce street fighting and taken prisoner of war. Yorck was then exchanged for a French officer in June 1807. He was awarded the Prussian Order pour le Mérite by Frederick III and promoted to Major General and commander of Memel, which is now in Lithuania. He stayed in Klaipėda, and of the troops stationed there on the Curonian Lagoon, where the Queen had fled from the French in 1807. Meanwhile, the headstrong troop leader and difficult subordinate Yorck had earned a reputation in the army as, quote, a man made of forged iron. Some saw him as the old Isegrim. But what mattered more to him was always the well-being of his soldiers, rather than the ruthless warfare of Generals Blücher and also Gneisenau, which he rejected. Looking back at the downfall of Old Prussia, the catastrophe at least had the effect that the reforms now being introduced made a renewal of the state possible. Then the Prussian army reform began in 1807 under such great minds as Generals Gerhard von Scharnhorst, Neidhard Gneisenau from 1814, and Karl Clausewitz from 1827. Under Clausewitz, Major General Yorck became commander of the West Prussian Brigade, and in 1810, H.R. was appointed Inspector General of the Light Troops. A year later, in 1811, he became Governor General, first in West Prussia, then also in East Prussia. In 1812, the French dictator Napoleon I made the decision to march with his army of around 600,000 men, mostly not composed of Frenchmen, to attack Russia. His campaign lasted until the 14th of December, ending in an indescribable disaster. Of his more than 600,000 soldiers, by early January 13, barely more than 70 to 80,000 had returned from Russia. Prussia, also defeated and occupied by Napoleon, was required to supply an auxiliary corps of 21,000 men, led by General of Infantry Julius von Gravert. After Gravert fell ill, who was a supporter of the forced alliance between Prussia and France, General Yorck, who was internally opposed to the alliance, took command of the corps. as part of the 10th Corps, which consisted of 1 French and 2 Prussian divisions. As part of the French Army Corps under the supreme command of Marshal Jacques Macdonald, Yorck marched with the Prussian Corps via Labio and Memel to Riga, in Courland, which is now the capital of Latvia, which had gone up in flames after a siege. But now, Yorck was also going through the most intense phase of his military life, which at the same time set the further Prussian fate in motion. Because when December 1812 came and news of the inevitable defeat of Napoleon's Grande Armée arrived, Yorck's essentially private insubordination of 1779 was repeated, but now as a European state action. Yorck had virtually overnight, with his corps of 21,000 men, become the deciding factor in the war. He could either use it to reinforce the exhausted Russians or become the savior of the remnants of Macdonald's army. His goal had also been to unite with the Prussian general at any cost, and he had blindly trusted him in this matter. Because with that, a first cornerstone could be laid for the newly forming French army. At the same time, Napoleon, who had recognized the danger of the Prussian corps breaking away, had tried in October and November to influence Yorck with medals and significant promises of money, but he had remained incorruptible. But several generals of the Tsar Alexander I had also repeatedly tried to contact him and persuade him to change sides. Yorck, about whom a comrade had said he was, quote, a great talent but a harsh, difficult character to deal with, was now struggling with himself. He had never been an intellectual soldier like General Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, or Clausewitz, quite the opposite. Because this conservative Prussian officer had always, quote, hated the entanglements of politics and viewed the military reforms with skepticism. But in return, he was a brilliant troop leader with an instinct for tactical situations. In this situation, it became clear to him that now, if they were to join forces with the Russians, the time had come for Prussia to break away from Napoleon. His officers had also advised him to at least declare the corps neutral for the continuation of the war. But Yorck was not ready yet. First, he wanted to ask King Friedrich Wilhelm III for permission. But all inquiries had gone unanswered, and others had angrily saying that ending the French alliance would betray his own king. As a result, the thoughtful Yorck, who had only his faith in Prussia and the justice of the world, took full military and political responsibility upon himself. On December 30th, 1812, after intense negotiations that took place late in the evening of the 25th, he concluded the Convention of Tauroggen with the 27-year-old Major General Hans Karl Count von Diebitsch Sabalkansky, who was born in Grosslippe, Lower Silesia, and served in the Imperial Russian Army in the now famous Pocherun Mill, about 3 kilometers southwest of Tauroggen. In the convention, he committed his corps to 2 months of neutrality. In case no contrary orders arrived from Berlin, which never came. After Yorck informed the outraged French Marshal Macdonald of this, with the words, "By declaring this to you, sir, I relieve myself of all obligations towards you," he had, on the evening of the 30th of December, written to King Friedrich Wilhelm III, "Your Majesty, I willingly lay my head at your feet if I should have erred. I would die with the joyful reassurance that at least I erred as a loyal subject and a true Prussian." Friedrich Wilhelm III had received the letter during a walk in the Orangery and was at first beside himself with rage. But when the news of the armistice had spread throughout the countryside, starting in East Prussia, it marked the beginning of an openly erupting uprising against French rule in northern Germany, which on the 28th of February 1813 also led to the Treaty of Kalisz in the Duchy of Warsaw. This is when Prussia had switched to the side of Russia. With this treaty, the end of Napoleon's rule over Europe was initiated. In Berlin, it was vacated by the French on March 4th. At the beginning of January, only a newspaper notice reported that Yorck had been dismissed and brought before a court-martial. That had been a necessary official disavowal of his person by the king, who was still residing in Berlin at the time, surrounded by the French. But when Friedrich Wilhelm III, on the 25th of January 13, had gone to Breslau with his entourage, and from there on the 17th of March had issued the Appeal to My People, along with Prussia's declaration of war on France, Yorck, at the head of his corps, entered Berlin with his corps, unimpressed by the frenzied cheers of the population. In the war against France, he then fought with his army corps as a general of infantry, initially under the command of the Russian Field Marshal Ludwig Adolf Peter zu sein Wittgenstein Berleburg, later under Marshal Blücher, and repeatedly played a decisive role in the battles. His last battle was on March 30th, 1814, near Paris. It led to the occupation of the French capital by the coalition army and to Napoleon's abdication. For his achievements, the now 55-year-old General von Yorck was awarded the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross on the 31st of March, and he was endowed with the estate in Klein-Oels, located 50 kilometers southeast of Breslau, today Polish Olesznica Mała. There is the memorial stone. He was also honored by King Friedrich Wilhelm III. He was raised to the rank of Count and honored with the title von Wartenburg. This was in remembrance of Yorck's decisive contribution to the victorious battle near the Saxon village of Wartenburg on the 3rd of October, 1813. He helped encircle the French troops before the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig. After losing the Battle of Paris to Napoleon on March 30th, 1814, he went into exile on the island of Elba in April, but already on the 26th of February, 1815, he escaped from there again and returned to France. During his so-called 100-day reign that followed, which actually lasted 110 days, and ended at the Battle of Waterloo on the 22nd of June with his final end, General of the Infantry Yorck von Wartenburg had been given command of the 5th Corps stationed on the Elbe Reserve Corps. However, he saw this as a harsh demotion and requested his resignation from the army. He only received this after the Second Treaty of Paris on the 20th of November, 1815, and after several repeated requests. On May 5th, 1821, Count Yorck von Wartenburg was appointed Field Marshal. 9 years later, on the 4th October 1830, he died at his estate Klein-Oels, where he was buried in the mausoleum designed by the renowned Prussian architect and city planner Karl Friedrich Schinkel. Yorck's coat of arms motto was in German, neither desire nor fear. Therefore, it is very welcome that the German armies of the 20th century honored this Prussian officer with one of their most important marches and still honor him today. But not only because Yorck was one of the most important commanders of the wars of liberation, but also because it was he who, with his Yorkian Act of Tauroggen, dared to take the decisive political step. Because the popular movement that broke out in March 1813 originated from Tauroggen,